So I am Kevin Thompson, as Lindsay said. I'm one of the hosts of Full Stack Talks, and I'm also a developer here at Planning Center. But tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about code review. We typically cover some more specific talks here at Full Stack, and I thought it'd be great to go over something that's applicable to everyone, regardless of what language you're working with. So to start, let's define code review. Typically when you think of code review, you might think catching bugs, quality assurance, or having someone approve a change. But the definition that I like actually comes from Derek Pryor's RailsConf 2015 talk titled Implementing a Strong Code Review Culture. And he defines code review as the discipline of discussing your code with your peers. And I think this is a great definition because it makes no assumptions about right or wrong. There's no hierarchy of roles, right? There's no senior or junior developers. It's a discussion about your code. And so code review comes in a few forms. Tonight, the examples that I'm going to be giving will be covering code reviews as pull requests. So if you're not familiar, this is a basic pull request. And the specific examples that we're going to be looking at involve these key elements. It's the title of the pull request, the description of the changes, and then below that we'll see some comments. So before getting into the examples, let's talk a little bit about why we review code. So we mentioned that you may consider it as catching bugs or doing a little bit of QA, and that is true, that comes up in code review. But we do want to focus on discussion, so let's look at one more quote. It is possible to commit no mistakes and still lose. That is not a weakness, that is life. So we could interpret this as meaning that you've written great code, but something may seem out of place, or it may be difficult for your team to understand. Basically, the code has no value if nobody knows how to work with it. So this is a quote by Captain Jean-Luc Picard. So obviously it has nothing to do with code review, but it kind of works in this situation, right? And I basically interpret this to mean that code review is not about the individual, it's about the team. So keeping that in mind, thinking about team discussion while we look at code review, there's a few things that we gain as a team discussion. So in a team discussion, we share knowledge, right? Team members learn about each other's code. There's no one person that's responsible for anything, so we get team ownership. There's no single point of failure, right? If someone goes on vacation, you're not going to lose out on who's capable of maintaining that code. And then new developers are quick to get up to speed on real code. They see the code that's being committed day to day. They're not being given menial tasks. They're able to look at complex code that everyone else on the team is already working with and comment on it. So with that in mind, let's look at a few examples. We'll start with requesting review. Now, through these examples, we're going to start with a simple pull request, and we're going to build up something a little bit more complex. So to start, we have our basic pull request, again, with the title. This pull request is lacking a description, so it's very minimal. There's very little information. We've got a title that just says that it's refactoring a method. In addition to that, I didn't point it out in the original slide, but if you look in the top right, several hundred lines have been changed. So now we have a pull request that's title is simply refactor method with a couple hundred lines changing. This is likely going to be very difficult to review. In fact, it may lead to a negative review with no real discussion. You may end up with something like this. So bad pull requests lead to bad reviews, and ultimately they're painful for everyone. So let's revisit that. Let's give it a slightly more descriptive title. So now instead of refactor method, we've got refactor user sign-in logic. So now there's a little bit more context, right? We know that user sign-in logic is changing, so we know which aspect of the application we can be looking at or we can be thinking about when reviewing this change. But there's still a lot to reason about. So maybe we've used an external system, we've got some sort of bug tracker or a card application where we track our tickets. So we'll add an external link to Trello, right? Now, let's just assume that everything is defined in this external link, that we've got a big, thorough definition of what this task was. You click into that, you should see everything related to this topic or this task. But for example, we visit that link and we get card not found. Maybe the person who's been tasked with reviewing this pull request doesn't have access, or the card's been deleted. Something could have happened and now that external context is gone. So we can improve our pull request a little bit more, right? We'll take that external context and we'll write a few lines. We don't have to be too descriptive, but we'll explain what the context of the change was. Why did we have to implement this change and how did we find our solution? The benefit of this is this pull request description will likely end up in our Git repo, right? It's going to become a commit message once we merge this into master. And so looking back on history, anyone will be able to revisit this message and find out exactly what the context of this change was. And we can improve it a little bit further if we're making changes that are visual in any way, user experience. We can include an image or some sort of GIF. So once we have a complete pull request with a descriptive title, a little bit of context, we've included an image, the number of lines is still a little bit large, right? So we've explained what the pull request is, but this may be a large change. So I recommend keeping pull requests as small as possible. Some people will recommend keeping your pull request under 400 lines. I strive for under 200 lines myself. And one way to accomplish that, if you're working with a large change set, is you can actually issue pull requests into other branches other than master, right? So maybe you have a large feature branch and you break it apart piece by piece and issue pull requests into that feature branch. An example of that, when you open a pull request on GitHub, you may see something like this. You're issuing a pull request into master from improved documentation as our branch. You could actually issue pull requests into improved documentation from some other branch or vice versa. You can pull requests between any two branches on GitHub. So if you're dealing with a large change set, try and create small pull requests, or at the very least, create small commits. And when you ask your reviewer to take a look at your code, recommend that they look at your code commit by commit instead of looking at it all as a whole. So in terms of requesting review, we've covered a few different things here. We've established that we should be descriptive, right? Clearly state what the change is and how we came about our solution. We've provided a bit of context. We took any external resources and we explained them in line. And we've established that we should keep our code or our pull requests small. Make it simple for our reviewers to look at this code. So now that we've created a solid pull request and we've established some rules around requesting review, let's actually get into reviewing code. So remember, you're reviewing code, you're having a discussion, you're not grading a test. Anyone should and could be able to review the code. It's not just senior members reviewing junior member code or one person being the gatekeeper for all changes to an application. Everyone has a different perspective, and all those different perspectives are what lead to good discussion amongst a team. So let's go back to that less than perfect pull request, or at least a variation of it, right? So now instead of refactor user sign-in, we've got revert simulator changes. Again, it's a simple title. It gives some idea of what to expect, but there's very little context. So with this pull request, our reviewer probably wouldn't be too happy. So we can improve that though, right? The reviewer's job is to ask questions in order to lead to a better technical discussion. We can ask things like, what do you think about this implementation? Or can you clarify these lines? Or maybe did you consider using this library instead of the implementation that you chose? So in this example, our reviewer may ask us to provide more context, right? Could you please explain what prompted this change? So the reviewer may not be thrilled about this pull request, but they can still engage in a meaningful discussion. So they don't have to spend a lot of time to see that there isn't a lot of context here, and that's their first question. Can you please provide more context? So they asked a polite question to engage in the discussion. So as the author of the code, we'll come back and either add another comment or we'll improve our original description. So now we have a little more context for why we made this change. Why do we open this pull request? And now that we've made this change, we probably have a much happier reviewer. And that reviewer is then going to give us some positive feedback, right? Make it so. They've reviewed the code, everything's good, we're ready to go. Our reviewer's in a great mood, we've got a positive review, everyone's happy, we can move on to the next topic. So remembering that this is a discussion, you should also provide comments or compliments on the code. You don't just have to ask questions or catch bugs or look for the negative aspects of a pull request. Did you learn something? Were you impressed by something? Is there something that you've picked up here that you could apply to something else in the application? Right? There are other benefits to this discussion other than just looking at the one change and giving it a thumbs up or thumbs down. So in this context, we've done a change on the documentation, and our reviewer may look at it and say, fantastic, this is significantly more readable. right? It's giving a little bit of praise for something that maybe that person didn't think of doing, but in some way it's improving the documentation or it's improving the code base, and that person's seeing a benefit, right? And this is a very simple change, but it still benefits the team. And specifically with new developers, junior developers, getting little bits of praise like this on simple things that they may have struggled with but are great additions, that can really help their self-esteem in their career. So speaking of new reviewers, code review is also great for them. So let's say a more senior member of the team has issued a pull request. Instead of just having their peers or people of an equal level look at the code, a new reviewer or a new developer could come into the team, junior or not, new person to the team, could ask questions and participate in the discussion, right? So in this case, our reviewer could ask to explain what the string interpolation is here in Ruby. And then our original author would come back and say, great question, this is what it does, and now that person has learned something. There's a little bit of knowledge share happening excuse me, within the team. So what should you review? There are a lot of different things that you could review. There's a few examples that I'll throw up on the board here. But ultimately, everyone brings something else to the review, right? You should review things that are important to you. Everything adds value to the team discussion. For example, myself, I typically look at test coverage, the shape of the code. Will something be difficult to refactor later on in the future, right? It may not have been the way that I would have implemented a feature, but if it works and it's easy to change, if it becomes problematic, then I'm not going to say anything about it, right? Let's get that code working. It solves a problem. It adds a new feature. Whatever the case may be, it benefits the team. So avoid nitpicking on things that you wouldn't have done, or try not to comment on things like syntax or style, which we'll cover more of in just a minute. So as a reviewer, we covered asking questions, providing comments or compliments, trying to be positive in our review, and avoiding unnecessary feedback. And one way we can avoid unnecessary feedback, like style and syntax, is relying on external tools to improve our process. That's our next section. Code review tools. So one of the first things you should do if you're trying to improve your code review process is implement some sort of style guide. So this is an example of the Ruby style guide that GitHub provides. It outlines best practices on things like syntax, naming conventions, and other general style rules. Another example of the same thing. What's important, though, is you adopt your own style guide. Either create one yourself or find a leader in your industry with your language that has already established a style guide, and have your team sort of gather around those rules and agree on something common. Because you should only have the tabs versus spaces discussion once, right? And once you have that style guide, you should codify it. There are a number of different tools that you can use so that you define your style or your syntax one time. This is an example of a Rubocop config, which is a tool that we use or that can be used by Ruby developers. Rubocop actually will read your syntax definition, and then in your editor of choice, it'll find the errors and highlight them for you. So in this case, it's highlighting the line 23 where there's a return, and at the bottom it states that there's a redundant return detected. But tools like Rubocop and ESLint allow you to continue your development and gain a little bit of insight into whether or not you're violating the style guide set forth by your team while you're in your editor. And so most languages have some form of linter like this and some sort of tools that work with your editor. So I encourage you to find the tools, establish a style guide, and then find the tools that allow you to apply that style guide in your development environment. Another thing while we're talking about pull requests is GitHub actually allows you to define pull request templates. So the way you do this is it's a markdown template that you put into a file called pull request template inside of .github folder if you choose. And you can define the basic template of your pull request. So whatever is important to your team, you can establish this pull request template, and then when someone opens a pull request on your repo, they'll be presented with the template, and hopefully they will fill out that template to make your job as a reviewer much easier. Just continuing that example, here's a little bit of documentation on how you can implement that pull request template. Again, it's just a markdown file that you throw in your repo. So if you do use GitHub now and you have a problem with people not filling out pull requests in the appropriate manner, a first step might be adding one of these pull request templates so that when they issue the pull request template, they get a little bit of information from you that states, please let us know how you came about, or what was the purpose for this change. Provide a little bit of context, describe how you came about your solution, etc. So we've discussed requesting review, right? Be descriptive and provide context. When you're reviewing code, ask positive questions and provide comments or compliments. And use code review tools to improve your process and automate basic tasks. With these 3 topics, I think you now have a solid foundation for better code review. You're able to issue great pull requests, you'll have happy authors and happy reviewers. And that is the gist of code review. Thanks. Are there any questions?
Right.
Sorry, there's a mic right behind you.
Oh, there you go.
Sure. Good talk.
Thank you.
As far as workflow is concerned, I'm curious as to what you recommend for somebody submitting a pull request and then wanting someone to review it, but that person who they're wanting to review it being in the middle of flow and not wanting to be interrupted for 3 hours. So I'm curious if you've run into this before, where you might say something like, you only should review pull requests in the morning or at lunch or something, so that you're not constantly interrupting people to always take a look at these things. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, the way that I tend to review code is I finish a feature, I take a look at whether or not anyone needs review. And this is, again, why I recommend keeping pull requests relatively small, right? I like it to take less than a minute, 5 minutes to review code. So if I can kind of jump in that process and review something, then we're able to knock out pull requests throughout the day. If you don't have that option and you have to issue pull requests to be reviewed at one point during the day, then what I propose as far as adding small changes to a larger change set may be the way to go, right? That way you're incrementally building up a larger pull request, and so whatever you've accomplished by the time that code review window comes around can be reviewed, and you can continue working on that feature.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm a little old school. I'm confused by the whole GitHub thing.
Okay.
What's the value, specifically, what's the value of having a lot of comments on code when what's still executed is the code? I don't understand the code review. In all of your examples, it was about comments made on the code, which don't really affect the performance of the code, don't really affect the clarity of the code. They just talk about these things.
So in these examples, yeah, they were very, very simple examples. But let's say theoretically there was a complex method that you had developed, or you try to be clever in some way. One thing that comes up commonly is regular expression, right? You write a complex regular expression. It may be difficult for someone to understand. That may be a good point for a developer not familiar with that feature or that aspect to ask questions, and the developer or the author to at least explain that, if not refactor it.
That's an excellent example. In a regular expression, the syntax is well documented. If I choose to use a regular expression that seems complicated to a junior developer, or perhaps to you, isn't that a matter of you learning the regular expression syntax better? And not changing the code that works adequately? Sure, yeah. I mean,
we're not necessarily saying that the code has to change. The point of the pull request is just to open a channel for discussion, right? So even if let's say you open a pull request and I don't understand it, that's an opportunity for you to point me to the documentation that will help me understand. Again, benefiting the whole team, right? If I as the junior developer later have to work on code that you've authored, it's in my best interest to understand that.
I guess I'll summarize by saying, wouldn't it be a better use of the team's time to actually review and comment on the code itself by writing better code, if they have it, rather than spending their time writing comments on the code and commenting on the comments that have been written?
I think you're kind of getting at the same thing, though, right? Like, how are you going to write better code if you don't know how to write better code?
I think the point of pull requests is for the betterment of the team. So you might know how to make beautiful regular expressions, but your team might not have that experience yet. And helping to educate them and bring them up, they're like, hey, I don't understand why did you do this way? And you can either say, oh, I did it this way because of this, or it could have been, oh man, yeah, I did this in a way that's really weird or something, so that when someone else comes in to edit this same code, they're able to quickly grasp, okay, I know this stuff.
We can continue discussion after if you want. If you need more. Yeah.
I think
You
it's
good?
a pretty good
Yeah?
example because I find looking at some code, I don't understand it, and then I have to search to figure it out. If somebody would quickly tell me, okay, what does this // colon do through a regular expression, I don't have to search that out. And it would just tell me to, and then the next person knows exactly. So they don't have to actually have to learn it. They could benefit from learning it, but it's just a shortcut.
I think there's another distinction being made there that as an industry, a lot of people have moved away from commenting their code in line, right? You're dropping comments out of code entirely, and a lot of comment and discussion has moved into GitHub. Something like that, where you may have a complex regular expression, maybe it just warrants a comment in line that says, this is how this works, right? But someone asking the question, either you could reply in GitHub, or you could just say, great question, I've added a comment in the code to clarify that, right? It's a place to establish the conversation, but that doesn't mean that everything happens in GitHub once the code is written. You go back and forth. You can revise that pull request based off of the discussion that happens. We can talk more after. Any other questions?
One sec.
So in my current position, we're doing the same thing. We have pull requests. Have you run into the problem where some people are willing to do more review than other people, and have you come up with a solution? I mean, the way we do it is we're writing a little program that just automatically assigns requests to people, but do you have a better way of approaching that problem where some people just don't have time, or, I mean, it seems to be a big issue.
Yeah, I think as a company, we've done pretty good about everyone being involved in code review. Different people review at different times, or spend different amounts of time reviewing code. And we have a policy of 2+1s, right? Yeah, exactly. So we do 2+1s on every pull request. So at least 2 people have had to look at the code, review it in some capacity, and approve it. Everyone sort of establishes a different criteria, and they give different feedback. As far as what you could do differently, I think it's different for every team. What's important is that you have a conversation in some way about the code, and you try and share the knowledge about the code in some way. All right. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin.